This video is going to walk you through how to use the standard forms or the basic templates to help you translate correctly. The advantages to this system is that it is an almost mechanical system. As with all translation, there's still a need to understand the original sentence that you were trying to translate and to have enough knowledge of the predicate logic that you can double check your translation. But this method is about as close as you get to a mechanical procedure for predicate logic translation. So what are the standard forms, or the basic templates as I'll call them? They are listed for you on page 2 of the Predicate Logics Primer handout. Make sure that you have that handy with you or just commit these to memory. In fact, the AEIO convention is a historic mnemonic device. They go in alphabetical order by vowel, A, E, I, and then O. And then the order is universal first, and then existential, and then affirmative first, and then negative. So in other words, universal affirmative is the alphabetically first vowel, then universal negative is the next alphabetical vowel, existential affirmative is next, and then existential negative is last. And what are these sentences? Well, universal sentences are all sentences. Notice that even though no firefighters are gloomy doesn't contain the word all, it is a so-called universal generalization. It is saying that all firefighters, none of them are a certain way. The existential generalizations are not about all things, but about some of them, or logically, actually, as you saw in the textbook, logically at least one thing. And the affirmative or negative side comes from whether or not there's a predicate being asserted. So here in the affirmative, firefighters are gloomy, whereas in the negative, firefighters are not gloomy. And what the strategy is just these 3 steps. Identify the standard form or basic template, then assign consistent predicate letters to the ordinary language predicates, and then drop in those predicate letter assignments into the basic template. We'll go through a couple examples here, including seeing a few slightly more complex translations that are going to require paraphrasing before we identify the standard form or basic template. Let's start by looking at a simple translation, or a translation of a sentence that's already basically an exact match for the standard form. Something like, some lawyers are honest. This is immediately recognizable as an I sentence or an existential affirmative. It's already, without any paraphrasing, it is a some F's or G's sentence. And so ultimately we know that the sentence is going to look a lot like the basic template for I sentences. Once we have identified the standard form or basic template, then the next step is to identify and assign consistent predicate letters to the ordinary language predicates. We've got 2 predicates here, lawyers and honest. Blank is a lawyer is one predicate, and blank is honest is our other predicate. And just like in the propositional logic, you are free to choose any symbolizations that you want, but it's usually a good practice to pick somewhat obvious symbolization. So for example, for lawyers, let's use LX, or X is a lawyer, and for honest, let's use HX, or X is honest. And then now the last step is just to drop the predicate letter assignments into the basic template. In other words, I sentences are existentially generalized, where the conjuncts are the predicates from the sentence. So that would be LX and HX. And in that sense, using the method helps you avoid common wrongs, like translating this sentence this way, which is a much weaker translation than the one that we actually want. There's an explanation of the difference on the Predicate Logic Primer handout. Now, here's a slightly tougher translation. The method still works, but we are going to want to paraphrase the ordinary language sentence into a standard form or basic template first. In this particular case, there are plastic bags is not immediately any one of our standard forms. However, if you think about what it's saying, there are plastic bags, it is paraphrasable into one of our standard forms, namely that some bags are plastic. Once we've gotten this far, and sometimes the ordinary language to ordinary language paraphrases are the hard part of the translation. If you can get this far, then once again, we have an I sentence. We know I sentences all look like this, and that what we need to do is figure out what our predicates are, which in this case, let's use BX for X is a bag and PX for X is plastic. And then we again drop the predicate letter assignments into the basic template, getting as our translation BX and PX. Now, as I mentioned in the last slide, sometimes it's the paraphrasing that's actually the hardest part of this translation, and this sentence here, only guests are welcome, is a prime example of where the paraphrase from ordinary language to ordinary language is the step that requires the most thought when you're using this method. Only guests are welcome. How do we turn that without losing any meaning into one of the standard forms? Well, it's going to be this. All those who are welcome are guests. I want to talk more about this paraphrase, but let's just finish the program. So all those who are welcome are guests is an A sentence, is an A type sentence. That's an all F's are G's sentence, and those get translated this way. If we can identify the form correctly and we can paraphrase the sentence correctly, then we simply need to identify our predicates. Here, let's use WX as X is welcome and GX as X is a guest. And using this method, we'll just drop these predicate letter assignments into the basic template. And so that means we get a translation that looks like this. Now, the hardest part of this translation was this paraphrase. And it's because sometimes there will be a tendency to paraphrase only guests are welcome as all guests are welcome. That is a completely different sentence, not just in expression, but also in meaning. Incidentally, this one would get translated this way. But take as long as you need to see why only guests are welcome is the same as all those who are welcome are guests and is not the same as all guests are welcome. Being a guest is a necessary condition of being welcome. Well, that's going to be this sentence underlined in green. All those who are welcome are guests. Or on that way of looking at things, it's even clear why the guest predicate needs to go in the consequent position of the horseshoe. Being a guest is a necessary condition of being welcome. In contrast, with the sentence in red, being a guest is a sufficient condition of being welcome. The sentence in red, it's not possible for there to be some guests that are not welcome. After all of them are. Now, only sentences can get tricky. And so when you are dealing with them, take that extra moment to make sure that in the original ordinary language version, you understand which clause is the only clause. And actually, as a throwback to the propositional logic, remember that the only if clause was the consequent. Well, in the predicate logic, the only or exclusive clause will also be in the consequent position. It is tricky because in ordinary English, the only clause can appear anywhere in the sentence. And so it's going to be up to you and your reading comprehension to be able to pick out which clause is being picked out as that exclusive clause. So now this is a tougher translation, not so much because the template system doesn't work, but again, because we have to watch our step on the paraphrase. Everything enjoyable is not legal, healthy, or moral is clearly an A sentence. All F's are G's, and so ultimately the translation is going to be something like this. But of course there's a complication because the G predicate isn't a single predicate here. In fact, it's a compound. But the paraphrase method still works. We just have to watch our paraphrase. In fact, if you think about everything enjoyable is not legal, healthy, or moral, and you think about what it's trying to tell you in terms of an A sentence, then this is the paraphrase that you get. All enjoyments are either not legal, not healthy, or not moral. Now, taking your time with the paraphrase is what's going to help you not make a mistake. Now, if we can get this far, then we start assigning predicate letters. Let's use EX for X is enjoyable, LX for X is legal, HX for X is healthy, and MX for X is moral. And then we use our template here, recognizing that, of course, this whole clause takes the place of the G there, and we get our translation. Here's one last example of where the paraphrasing does become trickier as sentences get more complex, but how if you do pay attention to your paraphrasing, this method can handle even complex sentences. This sentence, cats and bats are mammals. There's going to be an inclination to paraphrase this way, but we're about to see why this is actually a wrong paraphrase, at least logically speaking, and why this one is better. This paraphrase is tempting, I think, because the and also occurs in the original sentence, and because in English, all cats and bats are mammals, is maybe at least ambiguous between cats and bats being mammals and what happens when we translate this into the predicate logic. If we used an A template and we used cats and bats as the F predicate or the antecedent clause, then what we're saying is that all cat bats are mammals. That is to say, all things that are both cats and bats, or that is, things that are both cats and bats. Now, not only is there not such a thing as a cat bat, but that's also a much more restrictive sentence than the one that we are really trying to express here in the original. We're just trying to say that cats are mammals and bats are mammals, not that things that are both cats and bats are mammals. And if we can process that through, that's why we see this is in fact a better paraphrase, where we're using a disjunction, where we're saying that all the things that are bats or the things that are cats, those things are mammals. In other words, this translation. Now, I say that if you're careful with your paraphrase, the method still works, but I also think that when sentences get this complex, you really need to have that solid base in the predicate logic in order to catch some more difficult paraphrases. In other words, I do think that thinking in terms of the predicate logic gives you a better, clearer idea of the logical understructure of ordinary language. All translation, it just never is purely mechanical. And with very complex sentences, you've got two challenges. The first is making sure that your paraphrase doesn't secretly change the meaning, and then also just making sure that you do have that base in the predicate logic, that you can read predicate logic sentences well enough that once you've got a translation, you can double check it against the meaning of the original sentence. And along those lines, let's take a look at a few quick translations that do not work with this method, because these are just because these are sentences that don't fit into standard form at all. Singular sentences aren't generalizations at all, and so there's not going to be a template for them. With singular sentences, always make sure that you can identify the specific individual or individuals that the sentence is about. Give them a common sense letter like lowercase d. Then identify your predicates. Let's use Rx for X is a Republican, SX for X is a senator, and PX for X is from Portland. Then identify your operators. The main operator is going to be the conditional or the horseshoe, but the antecedent of the conditional is going to be a compound. Dan is both a Republican and a senator, right? And the consequent is going to be a negation. Dan is not from Portland. And so then for a translation, we get that Dan is a Republican and Dan is a senator. Then Dan is not from Portland. Unicorns don't exist. This is one that it gets covered in the textbook as well, but existence isn't a predicate. There's actually a long philosophical debate about whether or not existence ought or ought not be a predicate, and this actually goes back to that and some argument that we've seen off and on in this class, and a contribution from Immanuel Kant later on. But in any case, for logical purposes, existence isn't a predicate. Rather, existence is just a way of saying nothing is a unicorn, that is to say, nothing has the predicate of being a unicorn. And so there are going to be two equivalent ways of translating a sentence like this. Either it's not true that there is at least one thing that is a unicorn, or everything is not a unicorn. And for more on the equivalence between this left-hand sentence and the right-hand sentence, see the handout on De Morgan's for predicate logic. And this last sentence is also a type of sentence that just doesn't fit any of the standard form sentences. And it's because thingness also isn't a predicate. In other words, be careful that you don't try to paraphrase this into all things are good, bad, or neutral, where things is taken as a predicate. In the predicate logic, what we're talking about to begin with are things. Now, things is left relatively undefined. They are just, well, things. But that means that a sentence like this just simply gets translated for all x's. X is either good or bad. Disjunction always only has two disjuncts, so we need to close that off with a set of parentheses. Or neutral. And then there's one last type of sentence that this template method can't really handle, and it's sentences that aren't generalizations to begin with. Notice that this sentence at the end of the day is really just one big conjunction. Now the conjunction is of two generalizations. Some Fuji apples are tart is an I sentence, and no Granny Smiths are sweet is an E sentence, but the sentence as a whole is not actually a generalization. It's actually a conjunction. So using FX for Fuji apples, TX for X is tart, GX for Granny Smith apple, and SX for X is sweet, then we get this kind of translation.